evening. We're delighted to present Susan Hiller's first solo show in Ireland. Susan has had a very broad practice that reaches back over 40 years at this stage, and she has in that time investigated subjects such as memory, the subconscious, loss, the overlooked, the neglected, the forgotten, among many other areas. This evening, we're delighted to welcome Susan to the model, and we're also delighted to welcome McKee, the critic and curator. He's an old friend of the model at this stage. Francis, as many of you know, is the director of the Centre for Contemporary Art in London, or in Glasgow.
We've just moved.
Research areas is a particular interest in the subconscious and in spiritualism, and we may hear a little bit about that throughout the talk. So thank you very much.
I was going to try and stay away from spiritualism.
So was I.
But you'll kind of, telepathy, you'll know what we're thinking anyway. So I was going to ask you, because this is your first kind of big show in Ireland, I think, retrospective.
I think it is, actually. I have shown in Ireland before, but not in Sligo. And a while ago, I showed in Derry a long time ago when Declan McGonigal was there and various other places, but before their time. I mean,
they were a quite young-looking audience. Because of this, I was going to ask you some questions about you.
Okay.
Because I enjoyed your answers. We talked in London before Christmas, but we were talking about anthropology, and you said you started as an anthropologist, and you were in South America around Guatemala.
I usually ask people not to speak about this, Francis. Yeah, I mean, somebody once said to me, the only interesting thing about me was that I'd been an anthropologist. I take that as an insult. I left anthropology, and I'll explain again why and how I became an anthropologist originally, okay? When I was growing up, I didn't know about any women artists. All the artists that I ever heard of were male, and unconsciously, I must have decided that I couldn't do art because, the gender thing was wrong. Although that had been my great pleasure all through childhood, drawing and so forth, constantly drawing. And unlike another friend of mine, I just have to interject this, another friend of mine who's a very well-known artist, woman artist, who grew up thinking that Cézanne was a woman because it was like Nancy Ann or Jane Ann, and so Cézanne must be a woman. And she didn't find out about this until she was in secondary school. Anyway, so I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And when I was in secondary school, we had what was called a vocational office. That's where you go and they tell you what career you might be fit for or not. And there was a box with pamphlets that you could read about different careers, and there was one by Margaret Mead. I told you this before, didn't I? Yes. Margaret Mead, who was at that time a very, very famous anthropologist, and she was advising the president and doing in addition to which she wrote books which were so popular that they were in paperback, and they had titles that were very intriguing to a teenager, like Sex in 3 Primitive Societies, and so forth. So I knew who she was, and the pamphlet was called Anthropology as a Career for Women. And I think that was the first time anything interesting had been offered to me as a woman, if you understand what I'm saying. So that's what I did. I went off and studied anthropology. But I wasn't really temperamentally suited to the role of being both an observer and a participant. It seemed to me very schizoid. I didn't like that. And I also didn't like the gender problem within anthropology, which was that we were all trained to take a certain point of view, and when people went to other cultures, they only ever interviewed the men, and the men then told them what they thought the women thought. So that seemed obviously wrong to me, being a woman. And then the third thing was that we were also being trained to believe that anthropology and the other social sciences, psychology, sociology, etc., were value-free, whereas one discovered during the Vietnam War that a lot of the material that anthropologists had produced in an academic way, was actually being used by the government to subvert villages in Vietnam. So for all those reasons, I couldn't be an anthropologist. And one day during a lecture on African art, I started drawing the slides, the images as they came up on the screen, and I remembered how much I loved drawing. And at that point, mentally, I just left anthropology. And of course, that's because I thought art was a very pure domain to practice in. I didn't think there were any of these problems within art. I didn't think there were political issues. I didn't think there were gender issues, et cetera, et cetera. However, that's my relationship to anthropology. But I'm sure that in my work there are certain traces of my interests, and you could call them anthropological if you want to, but I prefer not to.
Yeah, it was partly, I've also got a personal interest in the mass observation group, and they seem to have a similar turn. Yeah. In that they were in Papua New Guinea and they were studying tribes. They thought, let's go back to Bolton.
Oh, is that how that came about? I didn't know that.
So they came back and they thought, let's apply the same techniques to Bolton as we've applied in Papua New Guinea. And then everything became quite surreal. And a particular form of British surrealism started coming out of that.
Well, isn't that because one of them was actually a poet? Yeah. And one was a sociologist, was that correct? So but that, in a sense, reproduced what had been done the early days of French anthropology. The anthropology group crossed over with the surrealist group, as you know, and people like Michel Leiris, who had been a surrealist poet, became an expert on Africa. And so these exchanges interest me very, very much. But not the pretense that the social sciences are somehow objective, value-free, and true. If we could think of them as a form of poetics, I'd be perfectly happy with that.
But then you arrive in the UK around conceptual times.
Yeah.
Which also seems to be saying it's very objective and very scientific.
Yes. Yes, it did. And it was convenient for me in a way, because having been doing sort of minimalist painting, and you know that people like the American minimalists like Sol LeWitt and so forth sort of merged with the conceptualists, and it wasn't a problem. And also the fact that while studying anthropology, I had been reading theory, which at that point was becoming fashionable in the art world. So all those things made it easy to make the transition. But I soon discovered that I didn't fit very well in conceptualism either, because I had an interest in a kind of content that a lot of conceptualism wasn't interested in. Because is anyone interested in this? Is art boring? Okay. The first generation.
They're fascinated.
The first generation of conceptual artists were philosophically inclined toward certain interpretation of Wittgenstein, and also were oriented toward language in a certain way. They made work that was already within language. How can I say this? Well, you know this. You can think about the work. English conceptualism was a little different, and I'm sure Irish conceptualism was different because we had Richard Long, and he was, after all, Gilbert and George. They were considered to be conceptualists in England, but they wouldn't have been in Germany and the United States. So I was interested in things that were not already in language. I was interested in things that initially one could only talk about incoherently, because there wasn't a way to talk about them clearly, unless, of course, you're a great poet. That we have to always make exception for that. So the things that I was interested in didn't fit really inside conceptualism. But in a way, I had sort of on the borderline anyway. And I think there's now a concept called romantic conceptualism, which is a slightly crude way of talking about artists, among whom I'm included, who deviated from this linguistic rigorousness of the early conceptualists. For example, one of the early pieces I did is a postcard work. It's very conceptual in the sense that my interest was in a group of postcards which all had identical captions, rough sea, but they had very different pictures. Well, the fact that I included these romantic, wild pictures of waves crashing against the shore was very different from the look of early conceptualism. But my approach and my initial interest was, see what I mean? But it was about, in a sense, imagery escaping from language. Yeah. Just imagery doing what it did and language doing what it did.
Yeah, because I think you talk about this dangerous fly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about the rough seas, that there's the same image on the same title,
Yeah.
but the image keeps changing. It
Yeah.
changes colour. People are painting it on the same day. I didn't know people produced them on the same day.
Yes,
That's
people did. The
fascinating.
photographers would go down. It was, of course, it's very exciting, these gigantic rough seas, and they would go down to the beach on that particular day, take a picture, date it, and then the tourists, visitors to those towns would buy it. And then they always wrote, I saw this, It's like matching your experience against the art. And then, of course, there were the ones that were not like that. For example, if you take a town like Brighton or Hastings in England, which have huge waves and enormous numbers of postcards, all captioned rough sea, the wave sometimes appears in front of a changing background of hotels as time goes on. They like the wave in the picture, but they slot in new hotels. Things like that interested me a lot, and the whole work is built up on that.
But that work in particular brings up two different strands of things that happen in your work a lot. One is that you started that work, I think, in the 70s, and it's still going. And there are new kind of addenda and
well, there's one here in
the rough sunsets
in the cafe. Yeah.
So that it just keeps growing.
Well, I guess because there were within that piece, for me, lots of unresolved issues. I would say I tried to do too many things at once when I first was approaching the postcards. And I examined different aspects of them. I said I was the curator, I was curating this body of miniature artworks, and so I had to look into all these details. And one of the things that interested me was the relation between photography and painting, which is obscured by the way postcards look when you finally see them. But not only is there changing the backgrounds or the foregrounds, but in places where they didn't have any good pictures of rough seas, they would just draw one in or paint one in and then present it with a real photographic background, or sometimes if different people were hand tinting a black and white image, which would then be re-photographed, so it looked like a photograph, they would do completely different skies, pink skies like the ones in my piece there, or sometimes a yellow sky, or etc. And I was interested in all those variations.
And then in rough sunsets, do you add the colours?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you've
Well, not
started-
all of them. I mean, it's a marriage between, just like it would be if you had a job, hand tinting photographs. Yeah.
You've almost added yourself to you've created a tradition and added yourself to it.
Well, I'm fascinated by those pictures, and I'm fascinated by people's fascination with the pictures and with the idea of nature being threatening and wild, and wanting to send pictures to your friends of the wildness of the place you went to on your holiday, whereas now people would tend to want a sunny picture of themselves in Spain or whatever. But some people still like to go to the sea when the weather is very, very bad, because it's incredibly exciting.
I'm one of
You think so? Yeah.
You're also an inveterate collector. That's
Yes.
another part of it.
Yes.
I don't know how you got all of those, and I know you still go on eBay.
I still collect them. Well, I mean, it started as a coincidence, as I think many collections start from some oddity. When I first went to England, I married an Englishman, that's how I got there. I was fascinated by a place that seemed to me to have the most wonderful name, and that was Weston-super-Mare. And I wanted to go to Weston-super-Mare. So we went to Weston-super-Mare, and in a sweet shop, I found a postcard of Weston-super-Mare with this caption, Rough Sea. And I was very, very intrigued because it's a caption describing the picture. Where is the caption? I mean, it was printed across the image. I mean, where is it? Is it floating on the sea, or is it, just this discrepancy between the two forms of representation, if you like, struck me as interesting. And then shortly afterwards, we had a trip. We went to Brighton, and I saw another one of these postcards. And I thought, well, if there are two of them, there might be more. And of course, it turned out there are a lot more. Practically every town with a seafront has something of the sort. So then it became a large collection, yeah.
Well, a different question coming out of the same works is the way you actually then display it and the format, the grid, back to a very conceptual tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, of course, talking about things that people can't see is a bit difficult, but yes, I displayed the charts where I analyzed all this material and so forth next to the images with the captions, because I think I was trying to find a way to show all the different stages of my own research, if you like, into this. But the whole thing escaped from that dry, I don't want to say dry conceptual, that dry presentation, because the pictures on the postcards are so attractive and so funny and so dramatic and strange and wonderful that that's really what people look at. They don't pay any attention to the analysis.
But you still use that analysis?
Yeah, but I'm using it visually now,
yeah.
Or trying to use it visually.
So is it with the J Street project, for instance, leaping a huge leap to the present?
It's the same method.
And is it for a different reason, though?
Yeah, the J Street project is different because I'm not presenting anything but imagery, really, and a map and a list of places. I'm not analyzing it. I'm leaving that to people to do. Have any of you haven't seen the exhibition yet? Oh, well, then, no. Well, you could tell them about the J Street project. Okay.
Well, that's difficult.
We'll let you do that, yes.
That's like a landmine. It's a series of, several different elements in the work. One is a series of photographs of every existing street sign in Germany that still has the word Juden in it.
Jew, yeah.
Yeah. And they're all numbered, and there is also a list which is numbered, so you can put the street to the photograph. And there's a map which again sort of helps you locate each of the streets in Germany. And a book which also then replicates this. And all of those together...
And a film.
And a film. So all of those together, the film is fascinating actually for a whole series of other reasons. So
Yeah.
I'll come to the film first. And maybe that structure, the first thing I looked at was the map, and then began looking at the gaps which we were talking about. There are gaps in the map where there are no streets. And then there are sort of conglomerations of streets in various parts of the geography of Germany. And that also sort of, Susan was explaining that all of the streets were wiped out during the war, and after the war, many of the street names were put back by the German authorities, but not all. And that there's still debates over removing some of them. So it's still in flux. But you do begin to analyse the geography, and then you begin to piece those together with the photographs.
But I leave that to the audience now to do, rather than trying to make a chart of all of the different permutations. Yeah. So the J Street project started when I was invited to do a kind of residency in Berlin, and I was walking around Berlin when I first got there with a kind of a sort of street map and so forth, and trying to figure out where I was. I looked up to see the street sign, and I saw that it said Judenstrasse, which means Jew Street. And I think that I was I've tried to explain the feeling, but it was basically a feeling of complete confusion, because I thought, what a really strange name for a street, and what a very strange name for a street in Germany, of all places. You know, that's why it had this loaded feeling. And I just didn't know what to make of it, quite honestly. So when I got back to my flat, I looked in, you know, they have a thing like the A to Z. Every street in Berlin is listed at the back. You can go through and find streets by their name. And I saw there were 2 other streets in Berlin in very different parts of the city, but with a similar name. And I guess, like the postcards, I realized that if there were a couple of them in one city, there might be more of them. And I found that there were, I mean, I had to do some research. I went, in fact, to the Automobile Association, where they had maps, being Germany, of every single place in Germany by name, and you could look up all the Jew streets and find them in different towns and so forth. Then I realized that this was a very interesting kind of unconscious memorial. It wasn't a big official monument to the Holocaust or anything like that. It was just something in lots of towns that was still there. So I thought it would be worth recording, and started on a kind of pilgrimage in Germany. As a result, I got to see some beautiful and fascinating parts of Germany that I think I never would have seen, and learned a lot more about the country, etc. So it seemed, after pursuing this for a couple of years, actually, that it should become a work rather than just something personal to myself. And that's how it came about.
And was it at that point that you then imposed the grid, for instance, or did you think of it that way from the
I
start?
use a grid. This is a heritage from my legacy from being a minimalist painter. I take the grid, as I think Carl Andre, although he's disapproved now, said, as a democratic, non-hierarchical form of arrangement. And I don't want to impose an aesthetic on this. And the same thing is true of the kind of photographs that I took and the kind of film that I made. I am not trying to say this is melancholy, I'm not making sad pictures. I'm talking about the ordinariness of the whole thing. So the photographs are snapshots. The film is very simply made also. And just putting them on the wall like that seemed to make sense.
I'm glad you said it's not melancholy, because I felt bad when I was watching it. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed seeing the streets, and the landscapes are very beautiful. And actually, the contingency of how you had to take the photographs means the composition is sometimes very open, strange. But I really like that, because it's not trying for the classic photographic composition.
No, particularly not of those subjects, because of course there are lots and lots of very beautiful photographs of some of these places, and they are tragic. But that tragedy is something I don't want to impose on the audience. I want the audience to think, my God, there were people living here, and they're not living here anymore, Everyday life goes on, and we know everyday life goes on no matter how much tragedy there is. Yeah. And that's sort of what's conveyed in the ordinary.
Yeah, and weirdly,
kind of
that's
photographs.
What's shocking about it in some ways.
That is what's shocking about it. And of course, we don't pay attention to street names. Nobody pays attention to street names, I come from a country that killed most of its native inhabitants, and we have names all over the United States that refer to former Indian people who lived there. Nobody thinks anything about it. If you try to open a discussion with anyone about it, they look at you as though you're mad. So that was why I guess I noticed this as a phenomenon in Germany, because it's something that I know from my own past of Native Americans being disappeared but very present in place names.
And do you think this is how psychologically would you look at this? Is it a repression or a not conscious thing, or?
You mean that we don't notice street names?
Or that they don't notice putting them back?
Which bit do you want to talk about? Well, look, they were old street names, okay? They were street names. The Jewish people were living in Germany before Germany was unified. They came with the Roman Empire, and they left their traces throughout the country the way the Romans did. And then, in later years, ghettos were established, but that wasn't originally the situation. And also there are 4 or 5 towns in Germany that are called, Jewtown, when there are no Jews living there now, because they were small villages where all the population was Jewish. And so the streets have different kinds of origins. And the fact that people don't notice the name, I don't know what to make of that. I mean, do you know, in towns that have names, for example, streets named after old mayors of the town, does anyone remember who that is? Usually not, I would think.
I guess it's areas where there's still wounds.
Well, where there are still wounds is something else, obviously. In Ireland, there are things about names. Every country has something. But I do know, I can only tell you about Germany, that I was concerned when I first discovered this phenomenon of these street names, that they might be new names that had been put up after the war through guilt or something like that. So I asked a historian at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and she said no, because it's not a very nice way to name a street. It's stigmatizing, No, they're all very old names, and if anyone wanted to make a commemorative street name now, they would call it something like Anne Frank Strasse or Albert Einstein Strasse. And you'll see, if you look at the film carefully, that there are a couple of instances where the old Judenstrasse sign and an Anne Frank sign are on the same corner, which is quite interesting. I think that in towns where they don't like the name, they change it. In other places, people may have a reason for keeping it. Usually, not because they think about the history at all, but because it's the name of their street, and they don't want to change the name of their street. It's very simple.
Could I relate that across to the other piece of the last silent movie?
Yeah.
Which again, you haven't seen maybe. So I'll desperately try to explain it. But it is a series of recordings of extinct languages by people who are mostly now dead, that you find in very obscure archives. I noticed Peter Kennedy is one of them, for the Manx.
Did you know him?
Yeah. Weirdly. And he's obscure, middle of Gloucestershire. So there's, and all of those sounds are on, the subtitles are on an empty film screen, a black film screen, and the sound graphs of the sound are outside in drawings. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I left the screen blank so that people could project. I mean, I'm interested in ideas of projection. Belshazzar's Feast, the video that's here, is also about projection. So is the Freud Prince. Projection in two senses. One, in the psychological sense, that we take our thoughts and we project them onto other people, onto other things, and so forth. That's a well-known, thing that people do. And then in the sense of a camera or a projector, a film projector projecting. So I left the screen blank for people to use it however they wanted to. And I personally think that the sound of the voices of the people speaking these languages means more than a picture of them would have done. Because sound is very physical, and when you hear something, it's actually, the vibrations are touching your ear, which is very intimate, really, when you consider it. And then my other interest is in these suppressed ghosts. And one of the strange things about the history of sound recording and radio is that we hear the voices of dead people, and it seems as though they're the same as the voices of living people. We can't tell the difference. And that strikes me as very strange.
And you were interested in Karl Raudive.
Yes.
Who also sort of said he could hear the sounds of the dead between the stations.
Yeah. Rodive was a I think Latvian scientist who, about the same time that John Cage was talking about silence being full rather than empty, Rodive and another man in Sweden, Jurgensen, about at the same time, started leaving tape recorders running in empty rooms and then amplifying the sound. And somehow, through the mechanics of amplification, voices emerge. And this is a phenomenon called electronic voice phenomenon. And I mean, if you're interested in it, you can look it up online. There are a lot of people looking at it, thinking about it, investigating it. And the interesting thing was that neither Rodive nor Jurgensen was ever accused of cheating. I mean, they had people observing them and observing their technique and couldn't find anything wrong with them, but they quasi-recognizable voices appear, speaking in various languages almost perfectly, and nobody knows how this came about. But we weren't going to talk about that now, because... But do look it up if you're interested. It's absolutely fascinating.
Well, moving away from it then.
Yes, moving on.
Again, I didn't feel bad this time, but watching the Last Silent Movie, I really enjoyed listening to it. It was quite like a celebration to me rather than a tragedy again. I loved it.
Well, the sounds of those languages are wonderful to hear, I think, you know. And it's also, well, I do find it very poignant. I find it very horrible. I find it horrible because, not the piece. The piece is meant to be celebratory in a way. But what I find horrible is the fact that everybody is going around moaning, oh, you know, 100 insect species have been, you know, made extinct this year, and we're killing all the birds, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, oh, we're losing languages, isn't that terrible? And nobody ever says why we're losing the languages, because the people are being exterminated, starved, moved off their land, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I always think about. It doesn't mean that it's not beautiful listening to them.
It reminds me of, again, two other things coming from it. One being just the sheer joy of the stories. And it's very, going back to anthropology just for a moment, I can't read anthropology, but I love buying Levi Strauss books and just reading the stories and throwing the rest away. I don't like the structural stuff. But the stories are great, and it's the same in the piece.
Well, there's some music, there's some stories, there's some very silly things that anthropologists ask these people to say, like lists of words. And there's one good story in there. It's about a man. An old woman is telling a story, and she's talking about some man who had 2 wives, and they didn't get on, and a man is listening to her, and he's going, oh, I never heard this story. This is great. And then she goes on how he killed them. And anyway, if you see the piece, you'll hear the story.
Well, the second thing maybe that coming out of that is, I wondered, is there an activist element in your work, and has that got stronger more recently?
No, I don't think so. I think that... You don't want to get in trouble thinking about political art. I think all art is political, and I think any position that an artist takes on any subject has a politic involved in it. And obviously, I do have very strong feelings about the use of other people's as anthropological subject matter. So that's possibly something that I'm dealing with. But the way there was a kind of political anger when I started that Last Silent Movie, because you see what happens is anthropologists or linguists go and record and study these wonderful languages, because every time we lose a language, we lose a whole worldview, a picture of the universe that's different than the picture our language provides. So we lose an incredible amount of knowledge when we lose a language. But then they bring their tapes or whatever back to their university, and that's it. Nobody is allowed into those archives for some reason that I've never understood. So I got angry about that. And I had help from someone who helped me get these stories. And I've attributed the sources as much as possible. So it's all there. You can see it for yourself. But I've never understood the kind of way that the stuff that's brought back is only supposed to be of interest to specialists. One of the most interesting languages and one of the most interesting speakers, in my opinion, is the man that I have opened the piece, who speaks one of those fabulous click languages of the Bantu people in South Africa. And he was asked in 1937 he was asked by an anthropologist in South Africa in 1937 to record a speech so that anthropologists in a linguistic conference back in, I think it was in Belgium, could hear his language. Well, he takes this opportunity very cannily to make a very political speech about what's happening in South Africa to his people who are being killed, and also to make a very gentle speech. He does the two things at the same time without anger. He says, well, he says basically, you're interested in my language, I'm interested in your language, I don't speak your language, you don't speak my language. In other words, he's trying to make a mutuality out of a situation in which he's not being seen as an equal at all. Okay, so it's a very wonderful piece of recording. It was recorded on a wax cylinder. It was perhaps played at the conference, I don't know, there's no record of that. But it ended up in a cupboard in a university library where it has been since 1937. And it was only discovered a couple of years ago when they were renovating the anthropology department in this university, and they were tearing down these old wooden cupboards, and they found this wax cylinder. Well, what is the point, of doing all this work and not sharing it? Why does it go into a cupboard like that? Which is exactly what happens.
So do you think the artist has a role in here, a very important role, because you also talk about the multiplicities of ethics in art?
I think artists increasingly are taking on a role. I don't know if it's not political art. I don't want to get into that, but increasingly taking on a role of what you might call excavation, like archaeological or psychological excavation, of bringing into view things which are usually hidden or suppressed or disregarded or et cetera, et cetera. This seems to be happening more and more.
Yeah. Well, you address it not being political quite nicely in the multiple ethics of art, because you say it's about the contradictory perceptions and visions of the world that we all hold at the same time, and that you're actually just complicating matters but not solving anything.
Yes, I think that complicating and not solving is a job, that we tend to do, and I think it's probably always been that way for artists. I guess if we could go back to modernism, when the modernists started experimenting with ways of showing the visual world that was not the same visual world that, say, photography was showing. Yeah. Not a good example, but that, I think, was another way of complicating our world and sort of destabilizing certain truths. And I'm not saying that artists are ahead of their society in this. I'm saying that they're probably expressing what the society is feeling anyway, but in a different way. They're finding a form for it. And I think that's just gone on increasingly now. So if you go now to a large, biennale or an art fair or something like this, you see a lot of work which is presenting everydayness differently,
And is everydayness always a part of your work?
I think it is. Even the strangest things.
I'm not going there.
No, don't. Well, if you do what you want, for instance.
But the Freud ones are, you've got the curiosities of Freud, and they're just checks and elements, slides that are sitting around in Freud's museum?
Well, yeah, but they're very odd, and they're about playing around with the visual. Because the key to that piece, which unfortunately you haven't seen either, is it's a fragment of a section of a letter that Freud wrote to his fiancée. And in the middle of writing in ink, he made a big blob in the middle of the page. And so what he did was he put a circle around this blob, which looks to me like a rabbit, but maybe it looks like something else to him, I don't know. And he wrote, "Please don't worry about interpreting this." So, I mean, that struck me as very, very interesting. So these images are from some slides. I've done a lot of work with slides that were found in the Freud family house in London, because I guess you know that the Freud family was expelled from Vienna and they ended up in England. Freud wrote his last book in England, and he lived there only for a few years before dying. But then his daughter, also a famous psychoanalyst, lived there and so forth. And there were there's a box of slides that a previous director of the museum let me look at. They're not part of the collection there. They're not archived. They're not. It's just a box of slides. And what they are, they're glass slides, and they're obviously the remnants of several different sets of slides. Because if they were these glass slides, of course, lots would get broken. So the particular ones that I've used in this piece are. They're like microdots. In the middle of the 2-inch by 2-inch glass, there's a tiny little dot, and that tiny little dot has been photographically reduced from an image of some kind. And when you enlarge them, you get very interesting, strange, blurry, slightly indecipherable pictures that have cryptic titles, like Queen Victoria with the bust of Albert in the back, hovering like a ghost, and so forth. So the idea for that piece for me was to let people have this pleasure of this indeterminacy, which is kind of what Freud is saying. He's saying, don't bother to interpret it, it's just an ink blot, so we can do the same thing with these pictures.
Yeah, that seems...
Have we done our thing?
Almost. I'll ask you one more question and then see if there are questions from the audience as well. So it gives you time to think. With that piece with Freud, you have a long association with Freud.
Yeah, not with Freud, but yes.
Personally.
Not at all.
But from the Freud
working,
Museum.
Yeah. Working on Freudian matters, yes.
How important is he to you?
Well, I don't know how important he is to me, but as I said at the time I did that piece from the Freud Museum, we all live in the Freud Museum. We can't get out of it. The Freud Museum, for better or worse, the Freudian concepts have stamped the way we think and refer to things, even though no one really believes in it anymore. And I find that fascinating.
And don't you believe in it anymore?
No, because I don't think that we're divided up in the way... Okay, no, let's just start again. Freud was a brilliant writer, and he was a frustrated sort of artist-type person. So his writing is actually much more ambiguous and rich than the concepts that come out of it, in my opinion. So, the ego, the superego, and the id, they seem like solid things, but they're not, of course. They kind of drift one into the other. And in fact, Bruno Bettelheim, who was a very interesting psychoanalyst in the United States who worked with children after the war, children who'd been traumatized by the war, he said that all of Freud had been mistranslated into English. For example, that Freud didn't talk about the ego, he talked about Seele, which means the soul. But of course, we don't have that in English in quite the same way. In German, it isn't just a religious concept. It means the person, what the person is, really. So Bettelheim said, we don't really know Freud at all. But for better or worse, we live in the Freud Museum, basically. That's why I'm interested in Freud.
Okay, see if there's some questions.
Well, could I just ask Susan, we have one seminal piece up there that you haven't mentioned yet, and that's Belshazzar's Feast.
Oh, yeah, we didn't mention Belshazzar's Feast.
No.
That's his fault.
It's true.
Which
I just
he
bypassed it.
just saw it in Liverpool, so possibly. No, Belshazzar's Feast is again about, it's about the TV. It's the first piece I ever did using this idea of projection, really. Using the TV screen, which just has an image of a fire moving in it. You know, Marshall McLuhan, this dates me, I know, 70s, but Marshall McLuhan said that the TV set had replaced the fire that had been in the primordial cave home of everybody. And the fire is a very important thing, and if you don't have a fireplace, you have your television set, which has these moving blips of light all the time. And I found some newspaper articles about people who'd seen faces on television after close down, which we used to have in England. Did you have that here, close down? The television used to go off at like 11:30 or something, and then there was just a signal, you know. So these people were seeing pictures on their TV screens when there were no pictures being broadcast. And yes, I made a video relating that to the story of Belshazzar's Feast, you know, in the Bible, where a whole group of people hallucinate. And they hallucinate messages of doom, and according to the Bible, that all happened. Well, the thing that was interesting about these people seeing faces on their screens after close down was this was all happening at a certain time, although, I mean, within a certain time frame, say 2 weeks. Although they were not all in one room together, but they were seeing television, and this was happening to them. And so I made a piece of work which, in a way, allows viewers to have the same kind of experience of seeing things on the screen which aren't there.
But very deliberately every day as well.
It is every day,
yeah,
for some people.
And the furniture is very
Yes, it's a living room. It's an eruption in a domestic space of something uncanny from watching too much television.
I think that's happened to most people here. Any questions? Yes.
What do you think, Susan, about the idea that language is a male-dominated concept?
That what?
Language.
Man-made language.
Male-dominated.
Oh, well, I think that's why it's not male-dominated. Okay, let's not oversimplify this. There's a book called Man-Made Language, which is very interesting and persuasive. But it's not quite that simple. But one of the reasons that I was interested in things that were not in language was because I experienced personal incoherence when I tried to describe aspects of my own experience. And all through the 70s, it was a very, very energetically political time, and artists had lots and lots of meetings and discussions and seminars and arguments, and there were some very articulate people in the art world. Certain conceptual artists, for example, were very, very articulate. And then there were people who would try to get up and say something that was slightly different from this, at that time, very left-wing Marxist line that was going on. And they would get up and they would stammer, and they would get very worked up, and they would get emotional, and they couldn't find the words to say what they wanted to say. And that interests me, because when people can't find the words and they have to make a new way of saying things, that's where you get art, you know? So I don't think language is man-made. Maybe at one time it was, but it isn't anymore. I mean, we're all making language all the time. It's changing all the time. We're not strict anymore about keeping the same words. You know, we find new words, new concepts coming out of technology. Now, what did you want to say about that, though?
Do you think that making a sound work is a way of escaping that sort of idea of the man-made language?
Making what work? I'm deaf, I'm sorry.
A sound work.
Ah, you mean a sound work without actual words? Or a sound work using the voice?
Sound work using the voice.
Well, I think that's a slightly different point. Because I do think when women and other disenfranchised groups start to use their voice, and in art, literally using their voice, things do come out differently. Do you think that's why so many people are using sound in art now?
I just remember reading somewhere that, I can't remember who the artist was,
Mm-hmm.
but I think she's an Irish artist. I think she said that using sound was a way for her of escaping the...
Was that Alana O'Kelly? Who was that? Yeah.
That's it.
She was a student of mine, actually. And a very good artist. We were talking about her this morning, weren't we? And wondering why she hasn't done anything recently. Yeah, she's a wonderful artist.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Frances Haggerty used to talk about voicelessness.
Yeah.
And what
There's-
that would mean.
There's another artist whose name I can't remember who made a very interesting sound piece about taking voice lessons to change her accent. You know, there are so many. I can't remember. Does anyone remember that piece? It was fantastic. I mean, fantastically interesting. Wonderful work.
I remember hearing about it, but I can't remember who did it.
No, I can't remember who did it. Well, I think we should let them see the exhibition.
Yeah, I think so. Okay,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
coming.
Thank you.
You're in a very good state. You're in a very good state.